Okay, all right. So I think we can just start officially. Hello and welcome everyone to Qualify. We're a student-led teaching initiative and a forum for all types of researchers interested in broadening their understanding and practice of qualitative methods. And this semester, we are organizing a series of speaker events concentrating on the questions of epistemology and philosophy of social sciences and their relation to research methodology. In other words, a hitchhiker's guide to epistemology, theory, and methods. And on our first stop in this journey, we are concentrating on interpretivism. And we are very happy and honored to be joined by Professor Paul Lichterman, who is a professor of sociology and religion at the University of Southern California. He's the author of the award-winning books Elusive Togetherness and The Search for Political Community, and also the co-editor of The Civic Life of American Religion. For this session, Professor Lichterman kindly prepared a special informal presentation on how he thinks about interpretation and explanation as complementary rather than counterposed projects. And that is based on his informative and fascinating piece on theory and contrastive explanation in ethnography, which was assigned for as a today's reading. And okay, so today's meeting will proceed as follows. Professor Lichterman will speak for about 20-25 minutes. We will then open the floor for an hour of Q&A. During the Q&A session, you're welcome to ask questions about the paper, about the presentation, as well as relate questions maybe also to your own research and your own practice. I would ask everyone to keep your questions until the Q&A session, just to not interrupt the flow of the presentation. And during the Q&A, please raise your Zoom hand if you'd like to ask questions, or write them in the chat function of Zoom. Finally, just to let you know, Professor Lichterman's presentation will be recorded and possibly published on our YouTube channel later on. But the remaining of our session after the Q&A session, after the presentation, will not be recorded. So please, during the Q&A, if you're able to do so, keep your camera on. And now, without further ado, Professor Lichterman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariusz. I hope the sound is okay. Yes? Okay, great. Yeah, nice to meet you all, and it's good to know about Qualify. I'm happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation. So I was going to make a very informal presentation to draw out the perspective behind the article. I'm going to admit Wolfgang. Okay, and if there's time, and I think there will be, I'd like to do a very brief demonstration with some field notes from a recent project that I just published as a new book. I'll say a little more about that later. The demonstration will draw out some of the points that I was just going to speak with you. And thanks also to Wolfgang and Ophelia as well. So about interpretation, I have to start by making a little bit of trouble for you. I hope I won't disappoint you when I say there are different kinds of interpretive work that are informed by different epistemological traditions, and each has their own principles and practices, and very lively debates between them among ethnographic researchers. So that means the activity that we might call interpretation varies a lot depending on which epistemological tradition you are working in. The best thing I think for me to do is to tell you again a little bit about the principles and practices behind the article that you read. I do think it's a perspective that's useful for for a wide range of studies beyond the topics and the questions that my co-author and I happen to be interested in, but it is a distinct perspective. Others would speak differently about interpretation and the goals of interpretation. The article you read is informed by philosophical pragmatism as developed in the US starting 100, 120 years ago, and revived and reinvented in the last, say, 20 years or so among sociologists anyway in the US. So rather than try to convey all of that to you in 20 minutes, I will simply talk about interpretation the way pragmatists would. And you can probably pick it up that way. Start with a very basic orientation. I think of ethnographic interpretation as a special kind of claims making. So interpretations then are researchers' claims about what something means to other people, what a place or a person or an utterance or an activity means to other people. This means this is a different way of understanding interpretation from in other fields like comparative literature or the area that's called cultural studies in the US, where interpretation means much more what does the author think, what does the critic think this means. We'll do a reading of this text or of these people. Interpretation, again, is figuring out, I like to say it's figuring out how other people make associations, how people make associations between words and actions and people. So interpretations then are our scholarly claims about how other people, the people in our field sites, make associations. And as ethnographers, we subject our tentative interpretive claims to the test of interaction. We have a reality test every time we go to the field to see if we are capturing other people's meanings well or not. We know by seeing how people react to us, whether we have picked up how they are making meaning, how they are making sense together. We don't count on a symmetrical system of binary oppositions or master discourses to tell us how other people are making associations. We discover how they do that by observing and interacting as field workers. If we fail, we get kicked out of our field sites, people laugh at us, and then we understand we probably have not been interpreting quite right what is going on. So we have these live tests every time we go to the field, and this is part of how we develop interpretations. This would be very much a pragmatist perspective on what we do as interpretive scholars. We do expect some regularities. How people make associations is not just random. It's not always emergent from zero. There are some regularities, and those are what we try to capture. And that gets to the second thing that I'd want to make about, second point I'd want to make about interpretation in general. Interpretation for whom? We make those interpretive claims for somebody. Interpretation is always an act of communication. We don't just figure out what things mean in our heads. But we do, we have to do that, but it's not worth anything unless we write them down. We're writing to some community of inquiry that was not at the site with us, and part of the art of interpretation is to take the association making that we think we have discovered and communicate that in some accessible form for a community of inquiry that was not there with us. We're taking what was implicit in our field sites and making it explicit for other people who are not there. And again, I think it's good to think of that as a craft or an art. That's why our interpretive claims usually involve some implicit principle or set of categories that we think the actors are relying on as they move through the action in a scene that we're studying. This is a relatively easy way to convey those patterns of association making to other people who are not at the site with us. We say there is this shared category that people seem to have, at least implicitly, or an implicit principle that guides how they make sense together. We arrive at those by making guesses, by launching interpretive hypotheses, you could call them, and coding field notes to see whether our guesses have evidence to support them or not. I'll show you a little bit of that process soon. So this means that my approach to interpretation is dialogical. We're in dialogue with one or more communities of inquiry. That may mean other researchers. It may mean publics that are non-academic that matter to us. It may mean the people that we're writing about. More and more in the US, people talk about doing work that speaks directly to the people that we're studying, as well as other academic audiences. That brings us to two big summary points about the article that you read. These are in the article. I think it may be worth drawing them out since the article is kind of dense. The first one is that interpretive work depends on theoretical commitments, theoretical decisions. Interpretation is not a pure activity separate from our conceptual interests as scholars. We don't just try to interpret everything. That is impossible. We don't interpret everything in our field sites. Our theoretical interests guide us. There are three very significant points or crossroads, you might say, in a research project at which we, whether we quite realize it or not, we rely on our theoretical commitments to help us through those crossroads. The first is we decide what we have a case of. And we can say in US English, case as a verb. We case our field sites. Any site could be cased in more than one way. We could say the same empirical site is a case of more than one thing. This is a very important move in pretty much any ethnographic study. Later on, we'd settle on a good research question, a question based on the action that we've been observing, not simply based on an abstract interest that we had before we knew anything about the field site. There again, our theoretical commitments inform us. We can't just pretend we don't have any. We make those theoretical interests part of the way we craft a study that will speak to some community of inquiry. We are always doing that when we craft research. So those are two crossroads. And the third one is that if you are aiming for a causal analysis, if you're aiming to explain something about the action that you have been observing, then theory guides you when you settle on the terms of explanation, because just about any question or puzzle that you might be pursuing can become the basis for more than one causal analysis. We can think of that puzzle as happening among intersecting lines of action, and depending on which line we want to pull out, we will have a different explanatory story. I may get a chance to demonstrate that also with some field notes that may take a little bit longer. Each of those causal stories that we might pull out of the action in our field notes would be based on some distinct interpretive work. Different meanings matter for different causal analyses. And again, your theoretical background is what orients you so that you can figure out which meanings matter most. There are always more meanings than you are going to document in one study. The article that you read had a small example of that from an older study of mine. A lot of people would have read that study and they would say, oh, he studied church volunteers. This is a familiar category for US people. Many, many people belong to religious congregations, do some kind of free labor that they consider charitable. We call them church volunteers. For a lot of researchers, it would have been obvious that the final study should teach us something about religion and volunteering, or maybe about how churches function in US public life or something like that. The final study, which was the book Elusive Togetherness, it did not case my field sites as cases of church volunteers because religious meanings turned out to be not that important for the causal question that I was pursuing in that book. That doesn't mean that there were no religious meanings operating for the people that I was studying. It means that those meanings did not help me explain what I wanted to explain. And so I didn't spend a lot of time on them. I shunted them off to one chapter later in the book, but they were not the main objects for interpretation that were important for that study. Someone else studying those same 9 groups and projects might have had a different causal question for which the meaning of, the biblical meanings of volunteering might have been important, but they were not especially important for my causal question. So that's what I mean about which meanings. And this gets to so that first point was that our interpretive work is inextricably tied up with our theoretical commitments or theoretical background. The second point is that the interpretive work that we do, and I was just saying this really helps us do explanatory work. The two are not entirely separate. They're not entirely the same. They involve some different skills, but the interpretive work helps us do explanatory work. They are complementary enterprises for ethnographers, and the article tried to show that also. In the US, if you picked up a textbook that teaches ethnographic research, especially the older ones, many of them would say that explanation is an inappropriate goal for ethnographic work. Max Weber thought otherwise. He had the phrase interpretive explanation, but that seems to have fallen out of the mainstream of sociological discourse in the US anyway, until quite recently. In fact, my co-author of that article is one of the people who has been reviving it. We know not only from Weber, but from pragmatist understandings from John Dewey and George Herbert Mead and others, for instance, that action does not happen without meaning. And so our causal claims about how action happens need to include meaning. Interpretation and explanation are not just separate activities. We accomplish explanation through the casing and the comparisons that we make that select certain meanings, that focus our attention on certain meanings. So altogether, interpretive work, theoretical commitments, and explanatory work go together in this perspective. That gives us a big challenge. How do we know which meanings matter most? Okay, the article showed you the discovery that we go through to answer that question. The process that helps us figure out an explanation is also that sort of narrowing down process that helps us understand which meanings matter. And so for the rest of my discussion here, I wanted to try to demonstrate that to you. This will be a little bit of an experiment. I hope this works. With some field notes of mine, I want to demonstrate a little bit of this processual approach to interpretation that I was laying out and show you how that happens in relation to a very specific contrastive question and how answering that contrastive explanatory question goes along with zeroing in on the meanings that matter most for the explanation. Okay.